Miguel always lived a simple life in the heart of Jalisco, Mexico. The son of agave farmers, his routine revolved around the production of pulque, a traditional Mexican drink made from the agave plant. He never imagined that his simple life, focused on ranch work, would end up intertwined with the power networks of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The region, known for its pulque and tequila production, lived under the shadow of the cartel, an invisible presence but intimately linked to the local economy. Miguel, however, always managed to keep his head down, avoiding direct involvement with the cartel. But everything would change when the CJNG charged the floor, a fee on the business, for Miguel's ranch, unaware that he was actually taking care of the property of Mencho, the cartel's leader. This seemingly simple debt would trigger a chain of events that would forever change the lives of Miguel and his family. And you, have you ever imagined yourself trapped between the world of crime and the struggle for survival? Don't miss the next chapters of this story of courage, betrayal, and plot twists. Sign up now to follow Miguel and Lucia's journey in their fight for freedom and justice. Rural Mexico is vast and cruel. On the endless plains and in the distant mountains, what reigns is not only wild nature, but the presence of cartels that control the territory with an iron fist. The ranch where Miguel, known as El Pulquero, works is hidden in the interior of Jalisco. This ranch, far from the hustle and bustle of the big cities, could go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know its secrets. However, Miguel knew very well what was happening there. Miguel, a simple man of humble origins, was born and raised in the countryside. He learned to make pulque from his grandfather, a master of the traditional drink, which blends agave juice with natural yeasts. For Miguel, pulque was not just a drink. It was his family's heritage, a tradition he diligently preserved. He worked on Don Mencho's ranch, unaware that the true boss of those lands was not the man he saw occasionally, but rather Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, one of the most violent and influential criminal groups in Mexico. Don Mencho, though he never appeared directly, owned the ranch as a way to launder money and strengthen CJNG's distribution network in the region. Miguel knew this, but always remained oblivious to the dirty dealings that took place there, preferring to focus on hard work. His world was simple, but the peace he built every day, fermenting pulque with his own hands, was about to be destroyed. It all began on a hot summer morning. A group of CJNG hitmen arrived at the ranch, armed and with menacing smiles. They were known in the region for collecting protection money from small merchants, farmers, and even pulque producers like Miguel. Protection money was a kind of protection fee or extortion that had to be paid to prevent the CJNG from causing trouble in the area. That day, they arrived to collect Miguel's protection money, but unbeknownst to them, they were facing something much bigger. Miguel, always cautious and discreet, wasn't used to interacting with the cartel. However, an abrupt demand, accompanied by veiled threats, made him wonder if he could still ignore what was happening around him. It wasn't long before the hitmen grew impatient, and that's when one of the men said, unaware of the irony of his own mistake, "This ranch doesn't belong to just some old man anymore like you think, you worthless scoundrel. CJNG is in charge here now. Pay the minimum wage and leave in peace." What they didn't know was that the ranch they were trying to extort wasn't just any rural ranch. It belonged to Don Mencho, a man who, in the criminal underworld, had the power to make even the most audacious cartel members disappear. What would happen next? Nobody could have predicted. Mexico, with its imposing beauty and harsh reality, shapes the characters like the wind shapes the desert dunes. The lands of Jalisco, where Miguel lives, are populated by stories of hardship, overcoming adversity, and also by the complicit silence of people who coexist with violence in an almost natural way. But deep down, Everyone knew what was happening there, even if they tried not to get directly involved. Miguel, despite his reserved demeanor, was much more than just a pulque maker. He had a keen eye for the things happening around him, even if he chose not to get involved. The wisdom of his grandfather, who taught him to produce pulque by hand, also made him more attentive to the world. He knew that, in the shadows of the ranch, things happened differently than others imagined. The ranch itself was vast, with hundreds of hectares of land and several agave plantations, as well as a small stable and some buildings that served as workers' quarters. In the center of the property was an old farmhouse where Don Mencho used to spend a few days, but was rarely seen by Miguel. The employees, mostly peasants like Miguel, lived there in relative peace, unaware of the magnitude of what lay behind the cartel's operations. However, something was beginning to change. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel had a long history of violence and absolute control over its areas of influence. But Miguel's problem wasn't just with the hitmen who had arrived to collect the minimum wage. He knew the situation could become much more dangerous. One name in particular was always present in the whispered conversations among the workers. The Jackal El Chacal was one of the most ruthless henchmen of the CJNG and was on the trail of anyone who dared to challenge them. He had a history of making anyone who opposed the cartel disappear without a trace. But for Miguel, El Chacal represented more than just a ruthless hitman. He was the embodiment of a logic of violence that dominated the entire region. It was difficult for someone like Miguel, who had a simple life, to imagine how a man could be so ruthless. But he knew that this was the price of survival. On the other hand, Miguel's life on the ranch was far from being just a routine of hard work. There were also moments of interaction with other workers. Lucia, a young woman who worked on the agave plantation, became a constant presence in his life. She, like Miguel, knew what was going on there, but always tried to stay focused on her work, fearing that any involvement with the cartel's problems could be fatal. Lucia had an aura of caution and level-headedness, but her concern for Miguel became more evident each day. Lucia and Miguel shared a mutual silence, a tacit understanding that the world they lived in was crueler than they could express. But at the same time, there was a growing tension between them. Miguel sensed that something was about to happen, something that would force them to become more involved than they had ever imagined. What many didn't understand was that the extortion money demanded by the hitmen was just the tip of the iceberg. The CJNG didn't limit itself to extortion. They had their eyes on every area of the local economy, manipulating the pulque and agave markets, and even simpler products like food and medicine. Miguel's ranch wasn't just a source of pulque production. It also represented an important part of a much larger network. The extortion of the extortion money was just a small sign of the control the cartel had over people's lives there. Miguel, who until then had not interfered in the cartel's business, began to realize that he was trapped in a much more complex network. The moment he imagined to be just a simple floor fee collection was, in fact, the trigger for something much bigger. The Jalisco sun seemed more aggressive that day, burning the skin and announcing that something was about to collapse. The killer's visit had left invisible marks on the ranch. The silence among the workers betrayed the fear that coursed through everyone's veins. Miguel continued his routine, but each movement was accompanied by a growing tension in his chest. Miguel was used to the hardships of life in the countryside, but not to the constant pressure of armed men patrolling the property. The collection of rent had been the first step. The second came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, 3 black pickup trucks invaded the ranch. This time, they weren't just debt collectors. It was the Jackal in person. His presence was impossible to ignore. Tall, rigid posture, gaze as sharp as a blade. Everyone feared him except Miguel, who observed him with the calm of someone who knows he has no choice but to face his destiny. El Chacal stepped down from the vehicle as if descending from a throne, observing the agave plantation with an air of disdain. "This place has potential," he murmured, twirling a gold tooth between his fingers. "But there's a lack of administration." Miguel felt sweat trickle down the back of his neck. Those words meant only one thing. The cartel had decided to take over the ranch. El Chacal gathered the workers and announced that from that day forward, the CJNG would directly control the production and distribution of pulque. They would use the ranch as a strategic point for other operations. Miguel took a deep breath. He knew this was a huge problem, but the worst was yet to come. "And you thief," said El Chacal, pointing his finger at him. "He'll continue working, but now everything goes through us." Lucia, who was standing next to Miguel, discreetly held his arm. The gesture was small but full of concern. Miguel couldn't protest. He knew that any poorly chosen word could mean his death. However, there was one detail that completely changed the situation, something that El Chacal and his men completely ignored. That ranch belonged to Mencho, and the CJNG was unknowingly taking possession of property belonging to the CJNG leader himself. Miguel spent the night awake. With each step he took in the darkness of the barracks, he tried to imagine what would happen when Mencho found out. The cartel leader did not tolerate disobedience, much less defiance. But Miguel also knew that if he tried to contact anyone connected to Mencho, he could be accused of treason. The ranch was full of eyes and ears. Any movement would be noticed. The main conflict was beginning to take shape. The CJNG was unknowingly divided. The hitmen's mistake had triggered a silent internal dispute that could explode at any moment. The next day, Miguel received orders to increase production. El Chacal wanted the pulque distributed in cartel trucks, mixed with other cargo. This not only destroyed the tradition of the drink, but also placed Miguel as a key player in a criminal operation. With each barrel produced, Miguel felt he was digging his own grave. Lucia tried to comfort him whenever she could. Between quick glances and whispered words, she insisted that he needed to find a way out. But what was it? Meanwhile, other workers began to quietly revolt. Many were local residents who knew people who had disappeared because of the cartel. Now they were trapped inside their own homes, under the command of men who had no idea of the disaster they were about to cause. On a sweltering afternoon, two men arrived at the ranch on a motorcycle. They weren't from the CJNG. They wore ordinary clothes, but carried a small, almost imperceptible symbol on their jackets, Mencho's personal coat of arms. Miguel froze. Those men weren't there by chance. They called one of the ranch's former managers, talked for a few minutes, and left. However, that was enough time for the henchmen of the new management to begin to suspect that something was wrong. "Who were those people?" asked one of Jackal's men. "Visitors. Nothing important," replied Miguel too quickly. El Chacal heard, and he didn't like it. That night, El Chacal sent for Miguel. In the main barracks, lit by a single flickering lamp, the assassin watched him with snake-like eyes. "You're hiding something from me, you scoundrel." I'm not." "Yes," Miguel replied, maintaining a steady gaze. "This ranch," Jackal walked slowly, "that's not normal. Just a ranch." "Yes, that's true. But there's something about him that I'm still going to discover." Miguel knew he was walking a tightrope. One wrong step and it would all be over. The conflict was officially open. As tensions rose on the ranch, new dynamics and subplots began to unfold. The direct conflict with the CJNG was already clear, but there was something more at stake, something Miguel was beginning to understand the hard way. The tension among the workers, the whispered conversations, and the constant pressure were intensifying. And, although Miguel was the main focus of the plot, the stories of the other characters were beginning to intertwine, creating a more complex and multifaceted picture. Lucia, despite her initial reserve, began to reveal more of herself to Miguel. During the long nights working in the fields when the ranch was silent, she drew closer to him. Their eyes met more frequently, and their conversations became more fraught with tension. Lucia, in a low voice, began to share her concerns about the course of events. She was frightened by the presence of Chacal's men, fearing the worst for everyone there. But what truly troubled her was not just the impending violence. It was the fact that her brother Joseph, he was involved in something much deeper with the cartel, but nobody knew exactly what. Miguel was beginning to realize that Lucia had something to hide, but he couldn't put all the pieces together. The young woman seemed to hesitate with every word, always afraid of being overheard. She suggested, with a furtive glance, that Miguel be more careful about what he said. José, Lucia's brother, was a name that circulated frequently among the workers, but discreetly. He was known for being a reserved person, but also someone with a peculiar skill, that of making problems disappear in a practical way. José, a man of few words and calculated actions, worked as an intermediary for the cartel in the region. And although he was never seen directly with the hitmen, the evidence was there. He received large sums of money in exchange for favors. Lucia knew what that meant. José was deeply involved with the cartel, but she never knew exactly at what point he had become so committed to crime. The truth was, he had been caught in the CJNG's web much sooner than anyone could have imagined. Now, Lucia feared that José had become a pawn in this dangerous game, someone who no longer had control over his own life. Meanwhile, the other workers were beginning to show their own frustrations. The work on the ranch had become unbearable. The CJNG men, under El Chacal's command, began demanding more than the workers could deliver. Pulque had to be produced at an almost impossibly high speed, and the quality was starting to decline. Rumors began to spread. Some of the workers were being forced to participate in the cartel's operations, while others began to mysteriously disappear. There was a growing fear that at any moment someone would be invited to join the cartel, or worse, disappear without a trace. The feeling of claustrophobia intensified. While the ranch was divided between those trying to remain aloof from the conflict and those clearly committed to the cartel, the tension between the workers and the hitmen also reached a critical point. El Chacal's army, composed of unscrupulous men, began to apply even more pressure, and each day Miguel felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The workers began to divide. Some tried to resist silently, avoiding the direct orders of the hitmen, while others began to form a resistance, a silent revolt. It was clear that something big was about to happen. The pressure from both sides, the cartel and the growing revolt, was about to explode. Miguel felt that to escape the situation, he would need to act decisively, but he didn't know where to begin. He was increasingly aware that without the support of Lucia and the other workers, he wouldn't be able to face what was to come. The ranch, which had once seemed a place of peace and hard work, was now a silent and dangerous battlefield where no one knew who was on which side, and the key to survival could lie with anyone. Miguel, in his conversations with Lucia, began to press her more about what she knew about her brother. She was still hesitant, but she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. José was more involved in the cartel than she admitted. Miguel realized that if something happened to José, Lucia wouldn't be the only one to suffer. The situation for everyone on the ranch would become even more desperate. The situation was about to explode, and Miguel felt he could no longer wait to act. The sun was low on the horizon, tinging the sky a deep orange, when the turning point finally arrived. Something Miguel had feared all along, the complete collapse of the established order, happened suddenly, and as always happened in his world, without warning. Everything seemed peaceful at the ranch that morning, until a distant sound of motorcycles cut through the air. Miguel, always alert, quickly noticed the number of vehicles, more than 10 pickup trucks and motorcycles approaching. He knew what that meant. It wasn't the CJNG men. It was An incursion by the Mexican army, something far more dangerous and unforeseen than any visit from the hitmen. The soldiers arrived in large numbers, with heavy weapons, tactical uniforms, and armored vehicles. What Miguel couldn't imagine was that the army was there for a far more complex reason. They knew that the CJNG was taking control of key production and supply areas, and Mencho's ranch was a primary target. The soldiers began to storm the ranch, a deafening noise of heavy footsteps echoing through the buildings and agave fields. El Chacal, who was on one of his daily inspections, found himself immediately surrounded. He tried to react, shouting orders to his men, but the advantage was on the army's side. The confrontation lasted no more than a few minutes. Some of the sicarios fled into the bush, while others were captured immediately. Miguel, seeing the situation unfold, was paralyzed for a moment. Never in his life had he imagined that the ranch would be involved in a military operation. The presence of the army meant that the situation was far beyond his control. Lucia, who was in one of the fields, ran to him as soon as she heard the gunshots. Her eyes were filled with terror. "Miguel, what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miguel knew there was no choice. The time for a quick escape had already passed. They were now at the center of a conflict that surpassed everything he understood as reality. The decision had to be made quickly. "Let's go to the hideout. We can't stay here," he said, pulling Lucia by the hand. Chaos began to spread rapidly. The army was all over the ranch, searching the buildings and making arrests. Miguel and Lucia, running to one of the side sheds, found something that would change everything. Jose was there, not as a simple worker, but as an army informant. When Joseph saw them, his eyes narrowed but soon softened. He was noticeably thinner, and his gaze was filled with guilt. "I knew something was going to happen," said Joseph, without looking directly at Michael. Miguel stared at him, unsure what to say. The revelation was more than he could absorb. Jose, Lucia's brother, was secretly working for the government, providing information about the cartel's movements in exchange for protection. And now, it had all come to a head. What Miguel didn't know was that Jose had been a crucial piece in breaking the cartel's security at the ranch. But the real twist came when Jose, looking at the two with a serious expression, revealed what he truly knew. What Miguel and Lucia couldn't imagine was that the army hadn't just invaded the ranch to destroy the CJNG. The army was there because they were also after Mencho. "Mencho is closer than everyone thinks," said Joseph, his voice low, almost like a whisper. "And the reason for all this is that he has his eye on you, Miguel." Miguel's world had been turned upside down. He was being watched by Mencho himself, who knew that someone on the ranch, a seemingly insignificant figure, could be the key to ending the cartel's operation in Jalisco. Miguel's presence there, tending to the pulque, the drink Mencho so often used to launder dirty money, was no accident. Miguel knew nothing, but he was more important than he imagined, and now he was a target, both for the army and for the cartel. The confrontation at the ranch quickly reached its climax. While the army soldiers began to dominate operations, the cartel leader, El Chacal, was arrested, but Mencho was still at large, and the real battle was about to begin. Miguel and Lucia, now with Jose by their side, had a choice: flee with what they knew, or ally themselves with the military to confront the real threat that still lingered in Jalisco, Mencho and his empire of terror. The decision rested in Miguel's hands, but he knew that any wrong move could cost everyone's lives. The fight was far from over, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. The operation at the ranch continued for hours, and as the army took control of the property, the reality of the situation began to unfold before Miguel and Lucia. What had previously seemed like a small dispute between the cartel and the extortion of a simple ranch was now revealing itself to be a conflict of much greater proportions. Jose, with his revelation about Mencho, had dropped a bombshell on everything. The army was there not only to eradicate the local CJNG, but because there was a direct interest in capture or delete Mencho. The presence of the cartel leader in the region was becoming a fatal risk to military operations, and the capture of his second-in-command, El Chacal, no longer seemed sufficient. The Mexican government needed to act quickly to prevent the CJNG from regrouping elsewhere. For Miguel, the consequences were immediate. He was forced to confront the fact that his life would never be the same again. The ranch, which had once been just a place of work and family inheritance, was now plunged into a maelstrom of violence, betrayal, and above all, a struggle for control of territory of immeasurable value. The military saw him as a key player, someone who, despite everything, had connections to the heart of Mencho's empire, and the pressure for him to cooperate only increased. Lucia, stunned by José's revelations, began to see her brother in a new light. He was no longer just the brother she loved and respected. He had become part of a much larger game, and this made her feel betrayed, although she understood the complexity of the situation. She feared not only for her own life, but for Miguel's, who now found himself trapped between two worlds, that of the cartel and that of the army. But the real pain lay in understanding that José, the brother she had so fiercely protected, had put the entire family at risk. If the army found out he still had any connection to the CJNG, it could be a death sentence for him and everyone involved at the ranch. José, for his part, felt the weight of his actions. He knew he couldn't go back, and his involvement with the cartel was deeper than he wanted to admit. But now, with Mencho approaching, he was at a crossroads. On one side, the army promised protection and a possible escape. On the other, the cartel, led by Mencho, held immense power over him. Any attempt at betrayal would be fatal. Miguel, for his part, was more lost than ever. When the army arrived, he hoped the situation would somehow resolve itself, that the CJNG would be expelled and life would return to normal. But he soon understood that the problem wasn't just about the cartel's presence. The problem was that he was at the center of a fight for survival, where every move he made could determine his future and the future of those around him. With José's revelation, Miguel was forced to make a decision. He could flee with Lucia and José, trying to escape to a safer place, or he could somehow collaborate with the army to capture Mencho, knowing that if he did so, he would become an even more important piece in the war against the cartel. However, by doing so, he would also become a target of the cartel, and his life, as well as Lucia and José's, would be in imminent danger. José tried to convince Miguel that if they collaborated with the army, they could finally rid themselves of the CJNG's control. But Miguel knew that an alliance with the army was dangerous, and a betrayal by the cartel would never be forgiven. Furthermore, the uncertainty of his position between the military and the cartel meant he was playing with fire. Lucia, on the other hand, saw a simpler way out, to run away and leave everything behind. She knew that, however difficult it might be, leaving the ranch and disappearing would be the only way to guarantee her safety. But Miguel knew that this wasn't a real solution. Running away wouldn't solve Mencho's problem, nor would it protect the people he loved. The situation became untenable when, in the middle of the night, rumors began to circulate. The army had located a cartel base in a nearby town, and the operation was about to expand. Mencho was apparently aware of the military movements and had ordered his henchmen to intensify the search for Miguel and the informants. Miguel was now aware that his life and that of his family were being threatened from both sides. El Chacal's arrest had only been the tip of the iceberg. The CJNG would stop at nothing, and the army was also determined to capture Mencho at any cost. The decision was about to be made. Miguel, Lucia, and José had few options, and the clock was ticking against them. Stay or flee, collaborate with the army, or remain in the shadows, trying to avoid direct confrontation. There was no more time to hesitate. With the weight of the decisions that needed to be made, Miguel began to face not only external pressure, but also an internal battle. The simple man who cultivated agave and produced pulque had become a crucial piece on the chessboard between the cartel and the army. Throughout his life, Miguel had avoided getting involved in major disputes, believing he could remain aloof from the chaos around him. But now he knew he no longer had that option. As night fell, he sat in the small shed, gazing out at the agave field. The moon illuminated the vast expanse of land, and the sound of the leaves in the wind seemed heavier than ever. He thought about his life, about his grandfather, who had always told him that hard work in the fields would be his refuge. But deep down, Miguel had always known that the world outside was bigger than the small ranch. That night, the truth became clear to him. No matter how much he tried to run or remain invisible, Mencho's ranch was a strategic and dangerous point. He knew that if he didn't make a decision now, what remained of his life would be in a constant state of fear and uncertainty, and those he loved would be at risk. Lucia was the one who woke him from his emotional paralysis. She entered the shed where he sat silently, his eyes red with worry. She had always been strong, more so than Miguel realized, and at that moment she gave him the strength he needed. "Miguel, we need to get out of here. We can't wait for the situation to resolve itself any longer. I love you, but I can't watch you suffocate in this fear anymore. If we don't act, everything we've built here will be destroyed." Lucia spoke firmly, but the tone of her voice was heavy with a sadness that Miguel had never imagined. Lucia's words came as a shock to Miguel. She was right. Fear, the strain of living between two worlds, could not be the foundation upon which he built his future. He had to act. Jose, who had always been on the fringes, finally volunteered to make a decision. He knew that his loyalty to the army and the cartel put him in a unique position. Even if he tried to escape with Lucia and Miguel, the chances of being captured and tortured were high. "I know you two have more to lose than I do. What I did is unforgivable, but maybe I can help you get out of this alive," Jose said, his voice heavy with guilt. Miguel looked at his brother and felt a mixture of anger and understanding. Jose was so involved with the cartel that his options were exhausted. He knew that his only chance of survival was to sacrifice himself to give others a chance to escape. He had valuable information about the movements of the army and the cartel, and perhaps that would be enough for Miguel and Lucia to have a chance. Miguel knew that the only way to resolve the situation was to place himself at the center of the battle. He could no longer run away. With the help of Lucia and Jose, he formulated a risky plan to collaborate with the army, but strategically. They needed to deceive the CJNG and use Jose's information to destabilize the cartel's movements, without them knowing that Miguel and Lucia were involved. Miguel also knew he had to confront his own insecurity. The fear of losing everything, of making the wrong choice, paralyzed him. But looking at Lucia, seeing the determination in her eyes, he understood that the greatest risk would be inaction. They needed trust in each other more than ever. As the army prepared for the next offensive, Miguel and Lucia helped Jose deliver a critical message. They played the game in the most dangerous way possible. The army believed Jose was only cooperating to save his own skin, but in reality, he was providing false information about Mencho's location. This maneuver aimed to divert the cartel's attention, giving Miguel and Lucia time to escape and join the army. Jose's sacrifice was crucial, but it also had consequences. During the operation, when the army attacked Mencho's mistaken location, the cartel fiercely counterattacked. Jose knew his life was doomed, but he chose to do it to ensure his sister and Miguel had a chance to live without the weight of his betrayal. Meanwhile, Miguel began to understand something that had previously seemed impossible to him. He was no longer just the street vendor. He was a leader, a man who needed to make difficult choices to protect his family and his future. Alongside Lucia, he realized that his true strength lay in his ability to act, even in the face of fear and uncertainty. He had no control over the events around him, but he could control his choices. As the final battle approached, and the army prepared to face Mencho and the rest of the cartel, Miguel knew his role was crucial. He would no longer be a passive spectator. It was time to turn his courage into action. With José's sacrifice and the information he had provided, Miguel and Lucia were now in a race against time. The army had been deceived, but that didn't mean the battle was won. Quite the opposite. The final confrontation was rapidly approaching, and the atmosphere at the ranch, now a military operations field, was heavier than ever. Miguel sensed that the moment to act was almost here. The tension between the army and the CJNG was at its peak. After the army's failed operation, Mencho had changed his tactics. He could no longer afford to maintain silent control over the region. The cartel boss was organizing a heavy counterattack, using his resources and the loyalty of his soldiers to retaliate. The presence of El Chacal and his men was no longer a mere inconvenience. Now the threat was within his own borders. Mencho's ranch was a strategic point, but at the same time a minefield of intrigue and violence. For Miguel and Lucia, the choice was clear. They could no longer stand by and watch. The option of fleeing was ruled out, and the army, however much it represented a chance of survival, was also a double-edged sword. They needed to take control of the situation, even if it meant taking insane risks. Miguel knew Mencho was getting closer. The CJNG leader himself was no longer just observing the operation. He was actively participating in the reorganization of his troops to ensure no one escaped. Mencho's proximity to the ranch indicated that a confrontation was inevitable. Miguel had a crucial advantage. He knew the terrain better than any soldier in the army, and that could be the key to turning the tables. Lucia, always pragmatic, began preparing for the worst. She knew that the military operation, although nearing its critical point, wouldn't be enough to defeat the cartel without help from the inside. And that's when Miguel stepped back into the picture. Lucia also did her part. She went to the military base set up near the ranch and began talking to trusted soldiers, trying to understand what was being planned. She couldn't afford to be a mere spectator. She knew that the survival of both depended on coordinated action. José's information was still fresh, and the army didn't have complete confidence in what it knew. If Miguel and Lucia wanted to ensure that Mencho was captured or eliminated, they needed to play their game by the rules they knew. Miguel, unlike Lucia, focused his energy on the terrain and what was to come. He knew that the chances of survival for him and Lucia would be slim if they didn't find a way to destabilize the CJNG's control over the region. He went to the hidden caves in the countryside, where he and his grandfather used to hide Pulque reserves, and began to devise an evasion strategy and prepare for a real physical confrontation. The real challenge would be ensuring that he and Lucia had an escape route should things get out of control. Mencho's very nature and his blind loyalty to the cartel meant there would be no negotiation or peaceful exit. Any wrong move, any mistake, could mean the end for everyone. Amidst all the chaos, El Chacal's figure became even more menacing. Even after the capture of several of his men, the hitman continued to be a constant problem. He was determined to avenge the imprisonment of his subordinates and strengthen his position within the CJNG. The encounter with Miguel, which had previously seemed inevitable, now became a matter of honor. El Chacal knew that someone from within the ranch had betrayed the cartel, and he would not rest until he found the person responsible. Tension between El Chacal and Miguel had been slowly building. They knew that sooner or later their paths would cross violently. It was no longer a simple dispute over the ranch or control of the Pulque. It was a matter of life or death. Miguel knew that to prevent El Shakal from becoming an insurmountable obstacle, he would have to act first. Time was running out, and the choices made in the next few hours would be crucial for their survival. As night fell, preparations for the final showdown were nearing completion. Miguel and Lucia met at the old ranch house where it all began. She looked at him with a gaze filled with determination and apprehension. "We don't have any more time, Miguel. The army will act tomorrow. Either we stay or we face Mencho and his men head-on," said Lucia, her voice firm, but fear evident in her eyes. Miguel gazed at the horizon. Their future was uncertain, but he knew there was no turning back. The time to act was now. They prepared for the worst, knowing the final confrontation was imminent. The army was taking positions, but the real battle wouldn't be between the soldiers and the cartel. It would be between Miguel and fate, between him and certain death. Dawn brought with it a false calm, a silence that preceded the storm. Miguel and Lucia were prepared for the worst, and they knew this was the decisive moment. The army had already taken strategic positions around the ranch. But what they didn't know was that the real battle would take place within those borders. El Shakal, tireless and ruthless, was not just an enemy of Miguel. He had become the personification of the CJNG's entire nightmare, and a confrontation between the two was inevitable. The hitman knew that the only way to consolidate his position within the cartel would be to eliminate Miguel, or at least ensure that he was a brutally eliminated threat. Miguel felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he prepared for the confrontation. The army was there to capture Mencho, but the final battle would not be fought between the military and the cartel. It would be fought on the silent battlefield he knew so well, the ranch, the land his grandfather had cultivated and which was now scarred by fear and betrayal. The confrontation between Miguel and El Shakal took place at the end of a tense afternoon. They were in the heart of the ranch, the area where Miguel always felt safest. The air was heavy, laden not only with tension, but with an inescapable feeling that this would be the last time the ranch would be the same. When El Shakal appeared, Miguel saw him from afar. The hitman was calm, as always, but his eyes were hungry. He knew what was at stake. The two stared at each other for a moment, the tension palpable in the air before words gave way to gunshots. Without a clear warning, El Shakal advanced, his hands firm on his weapons, but Miguel was no longer willing to be just a pawn in Mencho's game. The first shot was the trigger. The shootout between the two began the instant Miguel drew his weapon and ducked behind a pile of agave. Bullets flew like a storm, tearing through the air and the surrounding earth. Miguel felt the heat of the bullets and the pressure of the moment, but he was determined. He knew that if he emerged victorious, his life would change forever. If he failed, death would be swift and brutal. The gunfire intensified as Miguel moved through the terrain, with El Shakal pursuing his every step. The violence of the situation, the imminent danger, reminded Miguel of what motivated him, protecting Lucia, protecting the ranch, and preventing Mencho from dominating yet another part of the country. During a moment when El Shakal was distracted, Miguel had an idea. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the strategic intelligence the terrain offered. He knew the ranch's secret hiding places, every shadow and every escape route. In a decisive move, Miguel managed to disarm El Shakal, causing the hitman to fall into a trap of his own arrogance. El Shakal, wounded and disarmed, quickly stood up, trying to reach for his knife, but Miguel was already in front of him, his pistol pointed directly at his enemy's face. The silence between them was deafening, and the tension reached its peak. It was clear now, Miguel was no longer the simple man he once was. He had changed. His struggle was no longer just physical. It was a fight for his identity and for his future. With a steady gaze, he looked at El Shakal, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Do you think you're going to win this?" asked El Shakal, still with a crooked smile, a last desperate effort. Miguel didn't answer. With a swift movement, he lowered his weapon, not out of mercy, but strategically. He knew that true victory lay in surviving that moment, in keeping his mind sharp and not letting himself be consumed by anger or fear. Seeing that El Chacal had finally surrendered, Miguel knew that, at least for that moment, he had won. Not only the physical battle, but the battle of values that had been fought within him. He was no longer the defenseless man hiding in the shadows. He was a survivor, someone who now had the power to change his life and the lives of those around him. However, the real battle was far from over. The sound of more motorcycles cutting through the air and the noise of approaching cargo trucks indicated that Mencho, the true leader, was not far away. He knew that El Chacal would not return victorious, and Mencho's fury would be far more devastating. Miguel prepared himself, but this time the fight would be different. Now he had unexpected allies, José's crucial information and Lucia's support. The arrival of the army soldiers indicated that the siege was finally complete. Mencho and his men would be confronted not only by the hitmen, but by the force of an army determined to end the cartel once and for all. Mencho arrived with an army of armed and merciless men. The CJNG leader knew that victory in Jalisco depended on the final destruction of the ranch and the death of everyone involved. But Miguel was ready to face him head-on. The confrontation would not only be a fight for physical survival, but also for the resilience of the human spirit. The battle at the ranch reached its climax. The army, with the strategic collaboration of Miguel, Lucia, and José, finally managed to weaken Mencho's empire. When the CJNG leader arrived, finding his empire on the verge of collapse, he was lost. There was no more room for his tactics, and the resistance was more organized than he had imagined. Mencho, surrounded and in despair, had to do the only thing he knew how to do to try and save his own skin: flee. He was no longer the invincible leader, but an ordinary man with his back against the wall. The military operation was successful, and most of his men were captured or eliminated. The cartel's network, which stretched throughout the region, was now in ruins, and the victory was bittersweet but definitive. Miguel, however, knew that the cost of this victory was too high. José, Lucia's brother, had been a crucial piece in the resistance against Mencho, but the price of his actions was not a simple thank you. José's death left an irreparable void in his heart, and his brother's sacrifice would always be a constant reminder. He had betrayed his own blood to ensure everyone's survival, but who would pay for it? Lucia, on the other hand, had to cope with the pain of losing someone so close and, at the same time, understand that her brother's legacy was now in Miguel's hands. They had lost many things along the way, but at least they had managed to stay standing. With the fall of the CJNG in Jalisco, the recovery of the area would be a long one, but the ranch was finally safe. The army operation and the collaboration of Miguel and Lucia gave the state the chance to regain control. But for Miguel, the victory wasn't just about the freedom of his land. It was about his own transformation. The ranch, which had previously represented only a life of hard work, now symbolized a struggle for survival and justice. Miguel, who had once seen himself as a simple and insignificant man, now understood that his life had been a turning point towards something greater. He had become a man who knew the value of resistance, action, and sacrifice. Lucia and Miguel, now more united than ever, stood there, observing the lands they had fought so hard to protect. Their future would no longer be one of uncertainty, but of reconstruction. They had a chance to start over, to transform the ranch's legacy into something that belonged to them and not to a criminal organization. But there was an indelible sadness. José wasn't there to witness the victory, and in his place, Miguel knew that something deeper was at stake. He had fought not only for his own life, but for a new life for Lucia and for the ranch. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt that, at least, he had done what was right. The army operation was not yet over, but the fall of Mencho's cartel was the first real victory. Jalisco, his family's state, was now free, at least for the time being, from a threat that had corroded the heart of the region for so long. For Miguel and Lucia, the future seemed clearer, but the ghosts of the past, the price paid for freedom, the loss of Jose, would always cast a silent shadow over their lives. They looked at each other, their eyes tired, but with a glimmer of hope. Finally, a new beginning was in sight, but also a profound realization that much had been sacrificed to get to this point. Months later, Miguel and Lucia's ranch flourished again, though in a different way. The land once marked by violence now exuded a sweeter scent, that of a new beginning. The presence of Mencho and the CJNG seemed distant, but the scars were still there, deep and invisible. The army had managed to stabilize the region, but knew that the cartels would not be easily eradicated. For Miguel and Lucia, peace was relative, and the future, though promising, was still at the mercy of the choices made in the past. The ranch flourished, but the shadow of what they had lived through would never leave them. The story of Miguel and Lucia reminds us that even in the darkest situations, human strength and the spirit of resistance can guide us to a new beginning. The price of freedom was high, but the courage to confront the empire of fear was worth it. And you? What would you do if you were in Miguel's place? Share your reflections on this story of struggle, sacrifice, and overcoming. Don't let the memory of this journey be lost. Comment, share, and inspire others to fight for what is right, even when the cost seems too great.